until it is the question and answer period, in which when you raise your hand using that reaction button, we will try to get as many questions in as possible. That reaction button.
Just one more thing real quick. If it's gonna take longer than until 6, I'm gonna have to leave. Just thought I'd let you know that, okay?
Okay, I think we can begin. So welcome everyone to our webinar, Shaping the Narrative: How Military Contractors Use Think Tanks and Lobbying to Lead Us to War. We're all familiar with the fact that war contractors make a lot of money on weapons. And that's what we focus on, the weapons they make and who they go to and how they're used and how much money they get. And that's certainly the case in Ukraine today. Whatever people think about the Ukraine war, and obviously there are numerous narratives floating around about that war, what's definitely going on is that these military contractors are making a tremendous amount of money. But this webinar will show that it's not necessarily the arms they make that is the most dangerous thing they do. And it will show, we'll go into the impact that they have on our foreign policy itself and on promoting that foreign policy. So we'll look at what goes on a little bit behind the scenes, into the actual mechanisms that go into the making of our foreign policy, and especially the media presentation of that foreign policy, especially regarding wars. Just before I introduce our speakers this evening, I want to introduce Ken Jones from the War Industry Resistance Network to just very briefly tell you about our group, and hope that you'll get involved with us.
Okay, thanks, Paul, and welcome everyone. So good to have you here. Many of you, maybe most of you, have been with us before, and you know exactly who War Industry Resistors Network is. Call ourselves WIRN, W-I-R-N. But some of you may not. And just quickly, we are almost 2 years old now. We got started in December, almost 2 years ago. And what started it was a few of us that were doing local actions against war corporations like Raytheon and Lockheed realized that there were people all over the country that were doing similar work, and decided that what we needed to do was get together and network ourselves. So that's what we are, is a network. And at this point, if you look on our website, we have over 40 what we call affiliated organizations that have their name and their link on our website. And if you're in an organization that's not already listed on our website, you know, let me know, send me a note, and we'll get you on there. Just so we know who all of us are and where we are. So that's what the network is. And our work has become largely doing webinars every month. This is our 22nd webinar over the period of 2 years. And we've done not just the war corporations themselves, as in tonight, it's not the war corporations themselves, it's the think tanks and the lobby, but we've done other topics like converting the war economy, the militarization of the borderlands, the police militarization in Cop City, campuses that have recruiting for military corporations, nuclear weapons, the IMF and the World Bank, militarization of space, State Department. There's a lot of related information that we've been trying to get up and out that's related to the military industrial complex and all of its tentacles. So that's kind of what we're about. And we do have, I'm going to put in our chat here, not only the link to our website, but we also have a Facebook group, and we also have a Twitter group. So if you're on any of that social media, please, join us and see what we do. We do almost every day. We post things one place or another, and check out our website as well. So we have a webinar coming up in a month. It's October 18th. And just to let you know, it's going to be about the Merchants of Death War Crimes Tribunal. And we've actually had a webinar with them one time before. And there you go. Thanks, Cole, for posting that. There's the information about it, and we'll put the link in the chat. You can register tonight, or I'll send a follow-up email after this with the recording of this session, and there'll be a link to the next webinar in there as well. So just to let you know, we also have one lined up for November. We've done one already on the spelling of the war in China, and now we've got another one coming up in November. If you know who KG No is, he's agreed to do one with us about the formulation of the preparation for war in the South Pacific. So that's what we've got coming up. And back to you, Paul. I hope everybody enjoys this webinar. I know I will.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ken. And Cole, if you get a chance to put the link to the reservation page in the chat, that would be great. Maybe you've already done that. So people can register for that next webinar. But now let us get into tonight's webinar, because I know everyone is chomping at the bit to really get into this topic. Let me just quickly introduce our speakers this evening, and then go right into the presentation. So Daniel Abel is a senior researcher at Open Secrets. And we're hoping by the end of tonight, a lot of you know more about Open Secrets if you don't know about it already. Because Open Secrets is the premier research group tracking money in US politics. Daniel oversees databases that track lobbying and the revolving door. He has been doing this work for 20 years, and he's still doing it, investigating foreign political influence and political action committees. Of special interest is his investigation of the personal investments of politicians. That's something we don't think about too much. Dan currently specializes in the political influence efforts of the defense industry. Ben Freeman is director of the Democratizing Foreign Policy program at the Quincy Institute, a source of information and webinars and research papers that we all depend on. Ben investigates money in politics, defense spending, and foreign influence in America. He is the author of The Foreign Policy Auction. This is his book. This was the first book to systematically analyze the foreign influence industry in the United States. Before joining Quincy Institute, Ben founded the Foreign Influence Transparency Initiative at the Center for International Policy, where he worked. He has testified before the Senate Armed Services Committee, and Ben's work has appeared in numerous media outlets, such as the New York Times, Politico, and CNN. Ben is currently a faculty member at the Institute for Defense and Business, where he teaches seminars on the defense budget process and the foreign influence industry. So let's get into this. Welcome, Ben. I just will mention that Ben just recently testified at congressional hearings on the Saudi Arabian Live golf tournament, joining together, becoming one tournament with our famous old American PGA tournament, and how this is really a negative development for our country and for golf itself. So that Ben gets around. Okay, so Daniel, would you mind going first to kind of talk about Open Secrets and how this lobbying process works, especially related to military contractors?
Sure thing. Thanks for having me. As Paul said, we at Open Secrets are focused on money in politics, and that means that we collect data relating to campaigns and politicians, lobbying. We work on revolving door issues, dark monies and super PACs, all kinds of things. We have our own small team of reporters that reports on these things and researchers who write longer reports. But our purview is really transparency with the goal of a more accountable government. So we don't do a lot of advocacy ourselves, except on very targeted transparency issues. But a major part of our mission is helping people like yourselves who are advocating for a particular issue support their arguments and activities using money and politics data. But today we're going to focus on defense, of course, and one of the biggest avenues in general of influence, at least in terms of money, is lobbying of the federal government. That lobbying amounts to about $4 billion in spending each year. That's by all industries. And that number is really just what we get disclosure for. And we only really get good disclosure for the direct attempts to influence government officials. So that means actually being paid to contact someone in the government. There's a lot of other types of activity like grassroots lobbying, where often a membership organization will contact their members and tell them to contact Congress instead of doing it directly. Or PR campaigns, social media campaigns, especially these days. And even things like advertising are not really included in the numbers that I'm going to talk about tonight. And the defense industry, maybe, they typically don't run ads at the Super Bowl or anything like that. But like, if you've ever been to Washington, D.C. and gone through the Pentagon metro station, you would have noticed that it's literally, and I mean that in its definitional sense, literally covered ceiling to floor in advertisements for weapons systems. So they know who they're targeting. But even when we limit things to this tight definition of lobbying, the defense industry spent about $140 million in 2022 and has spent $72 million so far in the first half of 2023. And we get these disclosures quarterly, so the next ones we'll see are at the end of October. But with that $72 million, they have at their disposal a team of over 800 individual registered lobbyists. And while the defense industry spends less than a lot of other industries, the biggest ones like pharmaceuticals and finance spend several times more than defense, they are somewhat unique in their concentration of power in just a handful of companies, which of course kind of reflects the reality of the industry. Though we saw, we get about 300 defense companies that report lobbying, but just the top 6 spenders account for almost half of the lobby spending. And those companies will be familiar to you. Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, General Atomics, Northrop Grumman, Raytheon, and just those 5 make up about 40% of the defense lobby spending. And it goes up to 47% if you include Boeing, which of course also has a bunch of civilian issues they're lobbying on, but they are, of course, one of the biggest defense contractors. So those big 5 or 6 companies make up half of all the lobbying spending. The other major avenue of influence is campaign contributions. to candidates and the party committees. Those major, the big 6 companies that dominate the industry spent at least $8 million on the midterm elections in 2022. And the industry as a whole gave about 43 million. More than half of that was directed to candidates by the company's PACs. And those are political action committees that can make contributions using the company's name, though it has to technically be separate from the company. They raise the money from the employees. So it's not like they get to use the business revenue to do this, but they do get to send the check in the company's name. And it's worth noting that the PAC is commonly run and controlled by the government affairs office at that company. So essentially the lobbyists are deciding where to direct the PAC's contributions and giving. And then those same lobbyists will hold fundraisers. So since direct campaign contributions at least are limited, these events can pull in a bunch of people and their money at once. And since fundraising is a major part of a representative's job, or at least it takes up a lot of their time, you know, the party puts a lot of pressure on members to fundraise. They suggest how many hours should be spent, and there's a lot of pressure to keep the dollar amounts up. You know, I've seen briefing documents from the DCCC, which is the main House fundraising arm of the party for the Democrats, where they suggested that 1/3 of a typical day should be spent that way. So they're briefing new members coming in saying, we expect that you'll spend 1/3 of your time on fundraising. So anything that makes that process easier for the members is highly valuable to them, of course. And you know, it could translate into an hour that they don't have to spend dialing for dollars. We've also found that the industry clearly is targeting members of the congressional committees that oversee and fund them. Of the $20 or so million the defense industry gave to members of Congress during this 1/17th, more than 1/4 of it went to members of just one committee, and that's the House Armed Services Committee, which is, you know, the originator of the main funding bill for the Pentagon. Another way that the industry accesses power in Washington is via the revolving door, meaning the passage of people from government jobs to the private sector, and sometimes vice versa. We did a report a couple of years ago that found, looking at Pentagon employees who went on to be actual registered defense lobbyists, and found over 100 of them basically since 9/11, and over 500 with employment history at the Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committees or the Defense Appropriations Subcommittees in Congress. So those, when we're throwing around a bunch of, you know, hundreds of millions and billions of dollars, those seem like small numbers. But that's a significant amount of people. The people have long careers, and these are really highly paid, connected people helping companies navigate the policy machinery and know what levers to pull. Not to mention the fact that those numbers are very specifically defense registered active lobbyists. Both research that I've done, and there are some academic papers that suggest that the universe of people working in government affairs or in influence, and what a lot of people would think of when they think of lobbying is at least twice as big as what we get through these disclosures, because of course there are rules that are frankly pretty loose about who exactly has to put their name on that report. And just for some context, there are usually 10 to 12,000 individual registered active lobbyists in a given year. So there's probably at least twice that number in Washington working on, working in the influence industry. It's also telling that 3/4 of the defense industry's registered lobbyists fall in this revolving door category. Having experience and connections in the government that they're now being paid to try and influence. And these people are also giving campaign contributions themselves as individuals. Sometimes if I looked at the top 10 lobbyists who are personally giving the most contributions, and 4 of those top 10 have at least one defense client that they work for. So these folks are giving themselves, they're bringing in money, more donors via things like fundraisers. They're in charge of directing where the PAC money goes. And then they are seeking meetings with the same politicians where they get to push their issues. So what is all this money aiming for? What are they hoping for? Well, based just on the lobbying reports, they most often focus on major funding vehicles. So like the National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, being the main one for this industry, of course. The NDAA is has seen the most activity so far this year, which is not strange at all. The big appropriations bills like this are often the ones that see the most organizations trying to influence what's in them, largely because they're considered must pass, and they're so huge that they often don't get as much scrutiny on some small part of it that you're trying to influence. So they see a lot of attention. But they also, the defense industry also advocates especially for a lot of R&D issues and funding at agencies across the government, like research in biologics and other programs at a lot of agencies. For a more specific and pointed example, I looked at the first 6 months of 2023 and found that all those big major companies, with the exception of Boeing, all reported lobbying the State Department or Pentagon, specifically about foreign military sales. And if you didn't know, there are offices in the State Department and the Pentagon that have to approve foreign military sales. So again, they're targeting the people in charge of their business on the specific issue of their business. And those foreign military sales, people who are more expert in it than I have found that the things, they're justified as defensive deterrence. That's why we sell to other countries. But a lot of research has shown that the things you sell now will end up fueling conflict zones down the line, because you can't exactly take them back. So it's clear that weapons manufacturers and their customers are an important part of the influence machinery here in Washington. But kind of to sum it up in a nice package, these companies for whom the US government is the customer that makes up the majority of their business, these companies spend millions targeting politicians, members of Congress, who actually hold the purse strings, and they target them with a large and effective lobbying team, while also giving to their campaigns. And to reiterate, the politicians spend a truly staggering amount of time fundraising. So they're grateful for these large checks. Some of these politicians are, in fact, personally invested in the companies. They own stock. They're also being visited by lobbyists who used to work for them or with them. And not to mention the fact that they may end up moving to K Street when they retire from Congress. So while, I should be clear that I can admit that money in politics does not determine everything, and in fact is just a, one piece of the puzzle with any issue. And especially defense, where there's national security issues and arguments going on and everything. But it's clear that weapons manufacturers have the ear of politicians and policymakers. They have a seat at the table when issues that affect them come up. And I don't want to take up too much more time, but I do want to take a quick tour through a few pages on opensecrets.org, since a big part of our work is collecting this data, cleaning it up, and presenting it in a more understandable way. So I want to show you a few things that will help you, dig deeper into this stuff yourself. Share. Okay, so this is the homepage. And the first thing I'd like to point out is in news and reports, in our reports section, the capitalizing on conflict page we have, that's the name really of the project we're undertaking, kind of focused on defense issues and arms issues in money and politics. And here you'll find updated lists of all the reports we've done, other webinars we've hosted, and then news articles that our reporting team has put together. I know we've got a reporter working on one on the NDAA that I expect should come out next week sometime. But as another great kind of jumping off point is, let me go back here, is in industries and interest groups. If you look through industries and land on defense, here you'll see a lot of different things kind of pulled together, where in terms of contributions, we have like historical totals breaking down the source and the who gave the money and who got the money, broken down by things like party. And further down here, there's this wall of numbers if you really want to get into the details, but you can look at how things have progressed over the years. Lobbying I'll touch on in more detail in a minute, but also who's giving to Congress, who the biggest donors are, and then who the biggest recipients of defense money are. And we have these pages for about 100 industries. So if you are interested in other industries, of course, you can look into those. You can also narrow things down. We're looking at the whole defense sector right now, but if you just want to look at aerospace or electronics, for instance, you can get more specific. Another great place with regard to contributions is in candidates and office holders. You'll find a section on congressional committees. So if we were to, for instance, look at the House Armed Services Committee, you'd see all the total giving by different industries to members of the Armed Services Committee. You can look at who those members are and handy little totals of how much defense companies have given to them. You'll find out who the biggest donors from all industries, or you can again look more specifically at just the ones related to this committee, which is defense in this case. And the other thing, again, is another way of presenting the totals by each of the more specific industries and their giving to this specific committee. We also have a whole section devoted to the revolving door. Here you can search for, say, Raytheon and say, who are all the people who have worked in the federal government and also at Raytheon. Or you can look at who's worked for the Armed Services Committee or an important member of Congress. And once you get down to an individual person, you can click on them and see their whole employment history. And then in terms of lobbying, really everything that gets filed in those lobbying disclosures we translate to this site. We're looking at the defense industry or sector actually right now. So you can see things like their historical giving. And then if we go down to a more specific industry like aerospace, again, you've got the historical levels, but now we can see who the biggest companies spending on lobbying are. And you can really get into the details if you look at a specific company. You'll find here everything about what lobbying firms they hired, what individual lobbyists they hired, and there will be an indication there of whether they've been through the lobbying, the revolving door, including links to the revolving door profiles that I just mentioned, what agencies they contacted when they were lobbying. Almost everyone puts the House and the Senate on their reports, but you can sometimes find that somebody is lobbying an agency that maybe raises a question of why they would be doing that. That could be interesting. What bills they mentioned in the reports. And then in issues, so like if Lockheed Martin hires a dozen lobbying firms, then something like 50 reports get filed every year about what those people are working on. And what we've done here is pulled it all together so that if you want to see all the issues within the general issue of defense, what they wrote on their reports, we show that actual text here. And unsurprisingly, there's a lot of defense appropriations and F-35 issues that they worked on. But this stuff is really great if there's something very specific that you're interested in seeing. If did Raytheon talk about cybersecurity or something, or a specific engine type or something, you can come here and even filter these results or look for very specific things. And I will end there. I know that was kind of a whirlwind tour, but I look forward to your questions.
Well, Daniel, thanks so much. Just to be aware of these sources of all these different ways of influencing not just elected officials, but officials in other departments of the government as well. It'd be great to have some type of outline that lists all these different ways, these different methods where influence is exerted, from political contributions to lobbying firms to to these other holding fundraisers and all this type of stuff. That would be, it's so overwhelming. So I'm sure we'll have some questions a little later on. Why don't we get to Ben Freeman to talk about think tanks and a little bit of a focus, hopefully, on think tanks and the development of our Ukraine policy. So Ben, welcome.
Thank you so much, Paul, and thanks to Dan, and thanks for Ken and to the whole WIRN network for having us here. It's great to be able to share some of our research. I know Dan's been working on this for years and years, and I've been working on it for a good bit too. So it's great to have folks willing to hear more about it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time with y'all, and I'll try to be quick. So I see some folks popping up with hands and question stuff. So I'll try to be quick so we can get to Q&A. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I think is a sort of hidden influence mechanism from the military-industrial complex, and that's think tanks. And the reason that influence is very much hidden, as Dan mentioned in his talk, with even with the campaign finance stuff, the lobbying, so much of this, we only know what we know because we know it, or because somebody's willing to voluntarily provide that information and to report it, to file those lobbying disclosures, to file the campaign finance disclosures. There's a lot of folks who don't file that information. And in the think tank space, it's even more of the wild, wild west, because think tanks are not required to disclose any of their funders, whether they're foreign, domestic, whether it's the military industrial complex or not. They don't have to make that information publicly available. But nonetheless, my colleague Eli Clifton and I and other folks at the Quincy Institute, we're very interested in getting at the military industrial complex's influence on think tanks. I'm going to share my screen too, to share a report that I did a few months back on this subject, where we did a deep dive on defense contractor funding of think tanks. And we want to see a couple of things. We want to see, first of all, how pervasive is defense contractor funding of the top think tanks in the U.S. And then we wanted to see, okay, knowing which think tanks are funded by the MIC, how are those think tanks interacting with media, and is media then letting folks know that, in fact, the experts that they're citing about defense industry issues are funded by the defense industry itself. So a few things off the top to jump out at you. It's a lot of bad news, frankly. So I'll just caution you for that. If you're hoping for good news from this, I don't have much. The first bit of bad news is that the think tank sector is really dominated by defense industry funded think tanks. In fact, of the top ranked think tanks in the world, we took a look at the top 50 think tanks in the world, and the top 10, all of the top 10 ranked think tanks in the world, every single one accepts money from the military industrial complex. Very few did not. And then when we started to go down the list a little more, some didn't. And so we ultimately found that about 77% of those top think tanks accepted defense contractor money. And the next thing that we found was that even beyond that percentage of think tanks that accept defense industry money, that the media was on top of that. They were even more reliant on those defense industry funded think tanks. And so we look specifically at articles related to the Ukraine war. The Ukraine war was just kind of sort of a test case for us to see we have this major conflict going on. who is the media turning to when they're writing stories about the Ukraine war? And what we found was that overwhelmingly, 85% of the time, in fact, they're citing think tank experts with ties to the defense sector. So they're getting cited about 7 times as much as non-defense industry connected think tanks. So the media bias that I think, I've talked with folks here before about this, that we sort of feel there's this media bias and a media kind of push and a drive to war. We wanted to put that theory to the test, and we used this case to do it. And what we found was those sort of hunches, those feelings that we had were very much the data bears it out, that those mentions, the media is disproportionately citing defense industry funded think tanks. Another issue we found too was that the very unfortunate part of this, we ended up going through over 1,000 different articles about the Ukraine war that mentioned think tanks. And we found an astonishingly rare for them to mention the think tank had defense industry ties. In fact, I believe it was just 24 instances where we actually found them recognizing this conflict of interest in the piece. So most of the time that folks are reading articles, about the defense industry, about the Ukraine war, they're hearing from defense industry funded experts without even knowing that they're hearing from defense industry funded experts. And so there's a huge conflict of interest problem here and a huge lack of transparency problem here as well. And so this led us to where we're pushing for a few things to fix this problem. One of them is to require think tanks to disclose their funders. We're sort of in an era that's of dark money think tanks, with many think tanks still not reporting any of their funders. In fact, some of the think tanks that we were able to obtain information from are think tanks that don't disclose any donor information at all, like the American Enterprise Institute, which I think is arguably one of the most hawkish pro-war think tanks in DC, doesn't disclose any of their donors, but we were able to obtain information that they are in fact funded by Lockheed Martin and in other defense industry firms. We want to make it not possible for the AEIs of the world to do that, to operate as what we call dark money think tanks. We want full transparency about who's funding a think tank. Particularly if it's the arms industry, and particularly, if that think tank is talking about questions of war and peace. We think the readers of those think tanks' reports and the reader of media outlets citing those think tanks have a right to know that those think tanks are being funded by the folks that they're talking about. We're hoping too that another big initiative for us is having think tanks themselves to publish funders within the reports, that if they're getting funded by somebody who is the subject matter of one of their publications, might have a financial interest in it, we want think tanks to voluntarily disclose that, and in a way not too dissimilar from what we see in the medical field, where if a medical study is funded by a pharmaceutical firm, for example, that has to be disclosed at the beginning of those medical journals. We'd like to take a model like that and apply it to these foreign policy think tanks too. And we've started to do our final one on this point is we've started doing a little work with kind of coaching up think tanks a little better, our media when they engage with think tanks, how to do that. And I think one of the first questions that we want them to ask any expert they're talking to is who funds you? And I know I saw in the chat earlier here, folks were talking about the Quincy Institute's funding. I think that's great. We would really, really prefer folks. The first thing when you hear about a think tank, go to their funders, try to find out who's funding them. And if it's a media outlet, we're starting to get more and more journalists to pay attention to this and kind of take this message to heart, because we feel that without that information, particularly when we're talking about questions of war and peace, if they don't have that context in there, at the end of the day, they're deceiving their readers. And we don't want them to do that. And I think most honest journalists that we've been talking to, they're in agreement there. So we're pushing for kind of an industry-wide reform there as well. Another issue I'll bring up too, just really quick. I have some folks mentioned my colleague Bill Hartung's what I thought was a very good webinar earlier on sort of capital investments, bankers, Silicon Valley investments driving the war machine we have here in the U.S. I would encourage folks to listen to that. And to Dan's point as well, Dan mentioned the revolving door. To plug Bill Hartung again, he has a great report that's coming out here in the next week or two on the revolving door for top military brass leaving office. Specifically, he's focused on 4-star generals and admirals who have left office, and it's a sort of where are they now brief. And I'll please don't tell Bill anybody, but I'll spoil it for you. Almost every single one has gone to work for the defense sector. So look for that from Bill in the coming weeks. And with that, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and let's get to some Q&A.
Okay, thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, let's get into some questions. We have an important announcement about this week coming up, this international mobilization for peace in Ukraine. And after some questions, I'm going to put some contact information up in the chat about that, because this is such an important week called by international peace groups everywhere. In fact, let me just put it in the chat now to get that over with. Okay, here we go. Hopefully people will take a look at this and get involved in this week. So let's move into the questions now. To ask a question, if you go to your reactions button underneath at the bottom of your screen and click on it, you'll see the opportunity there to raise your hand. I see some of you have already jumped in on this. I'd ask people to ask a question. It's fine to make a comment as well, but please, if you have comments, please keep them very brief so we can get as much in as possible. So let us start with Joanne Dufour. Cole, can you unmute Joanne so she can ask her question? Good.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yes, you reminded me of a piece that came out from ICANN, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, and it's called Complicit. And then I think they had a supplementary one that was, but it's talking on the same topics that you are. Did you work with them on that, or did they contact you? It's an excellent piece.
I'll out Dan and I. We're both in cahoots with them. We've talked to Susie Snyder and the folks over there a decent bit, and I fully. It's an absolutely wonderful report.
Yeah, what's the name of the recent one? Because I think Complicit was the first one. It's Squandered. Is that the other one?
I can't recall.
I think it was called Squandered or something like that.
Yeah, you can get Susie's reports by going to Don't Bank on the Bomb is the name of the organization. Go to their website and you should be able to grab that report. Okay, thank you, Joanne. Let's go to Elizabeth Fatah. Okay,
I have two questions. One is, what about foreign manufacturers of weapons? That's question number one. And the second one actually is a little off target, but recently there are Republicans who want to cut the defense budget. And are there any Democrats going along with that? I don't think so. So I'm just wondering, I don't know if you're lobbying people, this organization lobbying Democrats to cut the military defense budget, but I don't, unfortunately, it's only really I think, extreme right Republicans that have even mentioned military spending, cutting it, that is. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Daniel or Ben, any comments on that?
Yeah, I can speak to the second question. I think I very much take your point now. I think the loudest voices are certainly coming from the right now in this budget fight. We do still think we have some allies on the left. Senator Sanders comes to mind, Senator Warren. too. Murphy has been good on some issues with arms sales in the past as well. I can't sugarcoat it. It's becoming, few and far between. But I do think Sanders has been very vocal on it. He had a couple of amendments to reduce the defense budget in this cycle. Senator Warren has been very critical of the revolving door. And has done some great investigative work on that, and for folks like Dan and I was able to get some really good data on revolving doors, and it ties into your first question too, of revolving door folks going from the Pentagon to work for foreign militaries, and that was all Warren's initiative. Held a good hearing on it, had the Danielle Bryan of Pogo at that hearing too. So I think there is still cause from hope for her, and maybe folks like AOC and others too. So I don't think that the Democrats are completely out of it, even if we are hearing a lot right now from the sort of far right folks.
Right. And
Okay,
what about the military? Are there foreign military companies that have an influence in this country? Or, in other countries?
In other countries,
Yeah, looking at the lobbying data, like I was looking at who has lobbied on Ukraine in general, and one of the companies that popped up was BAE Systems, which is a British company. So they are there. They are not, at least in terms of the domestic lobbying disclosure, they're not spending as much as the US companies. But I mean, we've also looked at the, foreign entities are required to file under FARA, which Ben literally wrote the book on. So some of them may file there. They're allowed to take the option of filing in the same place as, like where Lockheed and Raytheon do. So there may be some in the foreign data, and that's something you'll also find on Open Secrets. We have a foreign lobby watch where you can search for those things. But I mean, even beyond those foreign companies, we wrote a report a couple of years ago that tried to kind of tie things between how much, if the companies or the countries getting the biggest sales from US companies were mentioning anything in these reports about their activity in the US related to arms. And I mean, the most notable one we found was Saudi Arabia mentioning having meetings with members of Congress and their staff and talking about arms sales, for instance. So there is definitely, some influence attempts coming from outside the US for sure. And BAE is not the only foreign company that's lobbying. That's just an example I just looked at. So that's why I mentioned that one.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything Dan said. The only thing I'd add to, and what I think is it's actually very interesting to do with Open Secrets is data. Dan mentioned the FARA data that they have, and they have the domestic lobbying data too. It's when those two start to intersect that I think you really get a powerful punch in this drive to move U.S. arms abroad, when you have a very well-funded lobbying operation coming from Saudi Arabia or the UAE. We found this for too. And you already have this, and they're spending tens of millions of dollars every year on lobbying and PR firms. Many of the same firms that they're hiring to push those arms sales, they also work for the people selling those weapons. They work for Lockheed, they work for Raytheon, they work for Northrop Grumman. And so you take that as this huge force multiplier. So then the same lobbying firm in the McKeon Group is an example that I use a lot, right? Former chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, Buck McKeon, leaves office and starts this lobbying firm. And immediately right away, his two biggest clients were Lockheed Martin in the government of Saudi Arabia. And very shortly thereafter, he's lobbying for arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It's that the influence intersections where I think that's when the foreign powers get a lot more bang for their buck. It's effectively our military industrial complex, combined with this foreign influence complex. And that's a lot of influence combined.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Elizabeth. Let's go to Edwina and then to Jeffrey. So Edwina Vogan.
A couple of questions. I wanted to know if Senator Mark Kelly, if there's information on your website about his involvement with contractors or with Ukraine. He just returned from Ukraine with a report, which was obviously very one-sided in terms of favoring the ongoing conflict. I haven't been to your site yet. And I wondered if there's been any kind of reform legislation. I know Senator Warren had tried to do something on banking reform. So I wondered if there's been any reform efforts. And I know that must be really hard. And I also wondered what else could be done, do you think, that we could have some influence on trying to break this chain, other than maybe through our congressional or senatorial representatives?
Yeah, well, I'll address your first question. I don't think we've done anything specifically on that issue with Mark Kelly, but you will, as a member of Congress, you'll find a profile for him on our website that will show, how much money he's raised, what industries it came from, who are the big people and employers giving to him, all that kind of stuff. So you can certainly dig into where he's getting his campaign money on opensecrets.org.
And I think to your second question is I was going to say it's the $1 million question, but it's the $1 trillion question. We're about to have a $1 trillion defense budget here, and probably not too many years. But it's a good question. And my take on it is that sort of to Dan's point earlier, the money is important. The tracking the money, having the transparency about everything that Open Secrets does, is so wonderful. We need that transparency. And then we need that in these other sectors too. The think tank field, we're trying to bring greater transparency there. So at the very least, people know about this influence. And we need to push back on it in other sectors too. The Hollywood, the film industry is just rife with MIC money. The Pentagon reviews hundreds of scripts a year because in order to make a lot of these blockbusters, they have to cooperate with the Pentagon. Tom Cruise doesn't walk across that tarmac without the Pentagon's approval. That script was literally read and edited by an office at the Pentagon. We need to push back on that. And so we're on some little level there, and there's many, many more. There's influence in the gaming industry, media, elsewhere. We've got to take the fight to all these different places. We've got to take, like many of you do, take the fight to local events. When these pro MIC events start popping up in our backyards, push back on those. It's really going to take a concerted effort on every front. I know we're kind of talking about, one part of that pie tonight, but it's going to be a lot. And we need a lot more people.
Thank you too very much on that. And thanks, Edwina. Jeffrey Bachtel would be next. Cole, can you find Jeffrey to unmute him?
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay, Jeff. Jeffrey, go ahead.
Hold on a second. I just listen. Okay. There. Alrighty. Now. Alrighty. Now I'm ready. I wanted two questions. Is this gonna? Is this gonna last any for longer? Because I have to get off to another Zoom meeting.
Another
First off-
10 minutes. So ask your question quick, Jeff.
Well, I did ask the host and co-host first off that if I had to leave, can I have a copy of the copy of both the chat box and the transcript?
We will be sending out a link to the recording of the event itself, not the chat box, though. So you will be getting that because you registered. Do you have a question?
Yes, I do. What all that stuff you said? Maybe we should put it in a video game that could raise more awareness to the subject. What do you think of the idea?
Now you're talking. Go ahead, Ben.
I love it. I mean, the defense sector, they're recruiting from the gaming industry. They rely on first person shooters. A lot of drone operators that they're recruiting come, straight from the gaming industry. They're on Discord, recruiting people there too. So, any way, we can push back on that and, make it less cool to kill people, that would be very, very good.
Any comments on that, Daniel?
I don't know that I have anything additional on that, though. That is an interesting idea. That would be cool.
So Jeffrey, get working on that. I know there are people out there that are interested in working with you on it. So
But I don't.
let us know how it develops.
Do you got any people?
I think I'll have to check. I know
Okay,
War Industry Resistance Network did have some people working on gaming, and so that we might be able to put you in touch with them. Let's see if Ken Jones can come up with that contact for you. Okay.
All right, because I'm probably gonna leave now.
That's
now,
okay,
so
Jeff.
I can...
Okay. Thanks for tuning in. Let's
Alrighty.
go to
Thank you.
good night now. Elizabeth Lee. Or I'm sorry. Yeah, Elizabeth Lee and then Michael Hoey. I think Michael's been hanging on there for a while. Elizabeth, you want to go first?
Sure. I just wanted you to know I'm from Canada. So do you know, by what you are creating your site, was it noted how many lobbyists from the States to do with the military were lobbying with Canadian politicians and did the Defense Department? Was that something that came up?
I'm afraid as far as open secrets goes, I haven't, we don't have much in terms of international lobbying, but a group like Transparency International would be a good place to look. I don't know specifically if they have information on Canada, but they're a great group that does some similar stuff to us around the world.
Okay, I'll follow up with that because I'm very curious because it's just out of sight in Canada. It's just, yeah. And so it's just happening. Nobody's even saying anything. They're just doing their thing. So it makes me think that there's been a lot of lobbying going on. Okay, thanks. That's all.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Yeah, if you find anything, Elizabeth, let us know that we can share it with other people. That
Okay,
would be great.
that's
Thank you.
wonderful.
Michael Hoey, you want to go next?
Yeah, I saw a Quincy webinar this morning, Quincy Institute, on bankers and bombs, and it was talking about the venture capital industry and how certain countries like Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates have so much money invested in arms development, and that if some reason we irritate them, that they can really mess up our financial system. So I'm wondering if that's something that's on your radar.
Very, very much. The person who helped to put that event together, Bill Hartung, he's actually on our Democratizing Foreign Policy team, and he's I affectionately call him my work husband. We work very closely together. Bill is a wonderful scholar, and so yeah, I'm very familiar with that project. And I think too, I'll tell you that event, I think for us, we think and / hope that we're going to be diving into that field a lot more. Because we think, kind of like the think tank part of the military industrial complex that I mentioned earlier, we think that is sort of a growing or a less known influence vector for the military industrial complex, that venture capital funding. So hopefully more events like that coming soon.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Good question. Just before going to Faisal Mansour, we've still got a very good crowd here, so we could take a few more questions. But I want to just let people know of this major mobilization going on around the country, starting this Saturday through October 8th. Back in June, about 30 peace movements from different countries met in Vienna and issued a call for people around the world between September 30th and October 8th to do everything possible to push the idea of ceasefire and negotiations in Ukraine and to oppose endless war, to insist that this war just has to end. There's a lot of disagreements among those groups, but they agree on the need for a ceasefire and negotiations. So I'm just going to put in a link, see if I can do it this time, to a national website that gives you all the events going on all around the country that you might want to participate in. A special note is a national webinar this Tuesday night, October 3rd. Is that Tuesday? I think
Yes,
so.
it is.
Maybe it's, Tuesday, October 3rd, with Cornell West and other speakers. This is a way that all of us concerned about Ukraine can watch the same webinar together and ask our questions together. So I'd ask people to open up that link that I just put in and get involved in this global mobilization for peace in Ukraine. So let us get back now to Faisal Mansour's question. Faisal, let's unmute you here. There we go.
Hi, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, so I asked a question in the chat, but Ro Khanna and Matt Gaetz did a video some years ago, a movie some years ago about congressional committee funding. And I was wondering if you've done any research into that and how to get onto a congressional committee, you have to bring X amount of dollars from a lobbyist to get on the committee. Have you done anything on that? Is that correct to begin with?
Well, I mean, I don't know that I know specifically about that, but there is a lot of fundraising pressure in terms of advancing your position within, the Congress. So if you have leadership aspirations, you better be raising, you better be a fundraising superstar. And that extends to the key committee chairmanships. For instance, appropriations chairs are very valuable or very sought after. Those people are expected to raise a lot of money. So I don't know about any hard data related to that, though, off the top of my head, though I know we have reported in the past on kind of the separation between like chairs and vice chairs and leadership versus your rank and file member.
Great. Okay, thank you, Daniel. Thanks, Faisal. Elizabeth, thank you. I think you've already asked your question, right?
Yes, I have.
Okay, thanks. So we are running toward the end. As moderator here, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask the last question. I was astounded, Ben, in watching a video of one of these think tanks that you write about and you've fully documented, actually holding a game in Congress where different congressmen were gathered around some type of war board, and they were getting a chance to, I forget whether it was to develop what military policies they would take in Ukraine, or maybe it was fighting a nuclear war. I mean, the fact that one of these think tanks would have the power to pull together so many members of Congress to play this war game together just was astounding. And so my question is, it's clear how all these companies obviously want to get as many contracts as they can, and whether that's through foreign sales or whatever. But I'm most interested in how they lobby for or push or provide experts to actually advocate policies, such as the present policy in Ukraine. Do you have a case study of that being done, of a think tank that receives this massive funding from the defense industry, and then they put out papers advocating particular military policies?
I absolutely do. And in fact, I'm going to very quickly share my screen. I was keeping this in my back pocket for our friends. Not this. Hold on one second. Let me cut to this real quick. Can everybody see my screen now?
Yeah.
This is a report. I will cut to the top of it so you can see who exactly produced this report. This is a report from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, one of the top recipients of defense contractor funding of any think tank in the U.S. And they are an incredibly hawkish think tank. And this report that they put out this past January effectively makes the case for making significant investments, billions and billions of dollars of investments in the U.S. Defense industrial base as a result of having empty bins in a wartime environment in Ukraine. It, of course, leaves out the fact that it was the defense contractors themselves who stopped making a lot of the munitions that are being used in Ukraine. And I'd also like to note, I contacted CSIS about this specific report for both an article and for the report I showed earlier, and asked them to explain why they didn't mention that they are funded by many of the companies that they mention in the report and would be advantaged by it. And they didn't feel the need to. But I especially highlight this report because of this segment right here. Not only are they funded by Lockheed Martin, producing a report that would be a financial windfall for Lockheed Martin if the recommendations were adopted, they actually quote the president of Lockheed Martin in this report as well. So this, to me, was one of those examples of, how can think tanks serve the interests of the military industrial complex? This is it. Checks about every box that they would want. And for, unfortunately, the Department of Defense has since agreed to do a lot of these capital investments in the defense industrial base and effectively agreeing to adopt the recommendations in the CSIS report.
Good example. Thanks, Ben. Just Dan, if you had just a final comment in terms of the lobbying and all that, especially the lobbying, how much of it is geared toward the Pentagon or State Department or the executive branch to bring pressure to bear for particular policies for different parts of the world?
Well, I think it's fair to say a substantial amount. Unfortunately, the data doesn't allow us really to pinpoint that like a dollar amount spent on various agencies. But I think, as I briefly showed or mentioned, when you look at the defense industry agencies that they lobbied, you will not be surprised by the things they listed. They're clearly targeting the parts of the executive branch that regulate them and spend get R&D money that will benefit them. The example of actually lobbying the State Department on foreign military sales when they have to get the okay from the State Department for those to happen. I think illustrates that there is a concerted effort to apply influence on those parts of the government where their business will be affected.
Yeah, that's so important. Well, thank you both very much. Just quickly, Dan, are you aware of the lobbying that was done to push expansion of NATO back in the late 90s? Is that a part of your history at all?
I'm not really familiar with that, no.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you both very, very much for a great evening. Lots of information. I think we're going to, send out the websites or the reports that you two are connected to. I think it's great that people can look up so much specific information on open secrets, and it'd be great. Like I said, it'd be great to have a cheat sheet that we all could have in front of us that kind of broke down all these different ways that defense firms can impact policy, because there's just so many of them that we're not aware of them all the time. But there's so much information on that website, Dan. That's great. So thank you both very much. Please continue your great work on behalf of our country, and hopefully we'll be seeing you all soon. And thanks for everyone for coming this evening. And remember, our next webinar will be October 18th, and you'll be getting information about that. So good night, everybody.
Thank you.